Rain hammered the deck like 1,000 fists as the sky burned in broken streaks of orange, the storm twisting the smoke into shapes that felt almost alive. Jack staggered through the chaos, the metal beneath him trembling as if the sea itself was afraid, and every breath carried the taste of rust and guilt. Fire rolled across the bow where sparks kissed the rain, hissing like they were arguing over who would swallow the night first. Ava's voice echoed faint from the comm lines, steady but strained, while Keen shouted orders through a world shaking apart piece by piece. Somewhere far beyond the storm, Takamura watched the same fire bloom on the horizon. A flame, he once said, would never touch him. The rain tried to wash the war away, the fire tried to carve its mark deeper, and the steel between them screamed under the weight of both. And in that twisting moment of smoke and thunder, one question clawed its way through the noise. When power grows faster than conscience, who answers for the flames it unleashes? Jack stood beside the battered bomber. Hours later, the storm replaced by a heavy gray calm that felt almost dishonest. The smell of burned fuel still clung to the metal, a reminder that danger had only stepped aside, not left. Keen walked past with a quiet nod, his face firm, but carrying something unspoken beneath it. Ava's voice crackled over the work channel as she guided a repair crew, her tone steady despite the exhaustion pulling at it. Across the ocean, Takamura received early reports claiming the Americans were preparing something larger than anything seen before, but he brushed them aside with the confidence of a man certain of his own strength. Jack touched the wing of his aircraft and felt the weight of the day settling into him like cold water, sensing the world was shifting, even if he couldn't yet see how. Ava worked deep in the shipyard pit, sparks raining down as steel plates clanged into place above her. The Essex hull rose like a giant waking from sleep, its shadow swallowing the ground where she stood. Sweat mixed with dust on her skin, but she kept going, driven by the strange feeling that this ship would change something far beyond her reach. Jack's voice echoed faintly from a distant radio interview, speaking about hope and pressure in the same breath. Meanwhile, Takamura reviewed new intelligence about American construction numbers, frowning at figures he once would have mocked. Keen observed flight drills from afar, sensing that each small change was preparing them for something bigger than any of them had faced. Takamura stepped into the strategy room where maps covered every wall, each marked with colored lines that once brought him confidence. Now, new red shapes indicated American ship movements, forming patterns he didn't understand. He listened to officers whisper about fresh carrier hulls launching every few months, rumors he still refused to accept. Far away, Jack practiced low-altitude runs, waves brushing the belly of his aircraft. Ava finished another long shift, staring at the towering hull with disbelief at how fast it had grown. King wrote brief notes in his logbook, pondering how a fleet could feel both strong and untested at the same time. Night pulled its heavy blanket over sea and shore as rumors spread like sparks in dry grass. Jack heard the mechanics whispering that a new class of carriers was coming, bigger than anything afloat. Ava walked past towering cranes, each movement echoing like a drumbeat, marking how close the launch was. Takamura received another report, insisting the Americans were building ships faster than Japan could track. Keen stepped onto the quiet deck and looked toward the dark horizon, sensing a shift he couldn't yet name. Something enormous was taking shape, and everyone felt it even if none could see its full size. The shipyard woke before the sun, its machines growling like hungry beasts as sparks cut through the dim morning haze. Ava stepped onto the platform and felt the ground tremble beneath her, the massive hull growing taller every day until it seemed ready to block out the sky. Across the ocean, Jack trained with a new squadron, the hum of fresh engines carrying a promise he didn't dare speak out loud. Takamura studied reports stacked across his desk, each page whispering the same unsettling truth. The Americans were building faster than logic allowed. Meanwhile, Keen walked the unfinished carrier deck where workers moved like ants around a giant made of steel and hope. Everything felt like it was speeding up, as if the world had found a new heartbeat, and everyone was being dragged along with it. Jack's aircraft skimmed low over the waves as he practiced tight turns, the wings slicing across the wind like they were carving the future open. He felt the force of each maneuver tug at him, reminding him how fragile a man was compared to the machines he trusted with his life. Keenan observed the drills from the deck, the sight of so many planes in the sky stirring something between pride and worry inside him. Ava worked through another long shift, her hands steady, even though her muscles begged for rest. Takamura dismissed a junior officer who tried to warn him about the scale of American production. But the unease lingered anyway, tapping at his thoughts like steady rain. Ava watched cranes haul massive steel plates into position, each booming thud echoing through her chest like a second heartbeat. Workers around her moved with quiet urgency, everyone sensing that deadlines no longer came from schedules, but from the war itself. Jack cleaned his gear while listening to distant engines roar, knowing each hour of training meant one less mistake later. Meanwhile, Takamura met with senior officers, their voices tight as they argued about how many carriers the Americans were truly building. Keen studied aircraft formations from the observation deck, picturing how these new ships would shape every battle to come. The world felt like it was gathering strength for something immense. Takamura paced the strategy room, his boots striking the floor in a sharp rhythm as he tried to ignore the knot building in his stomach. Every new message hinted that American shipyards were working around the clock, and even he couldn't explain how they were launching carriers so quickly. Jack noticed changes in his squadron too. New faces, more planes, tighter drills, and a growing sense that they were preparing for something far larger than a single battle. Ava walked beneath the towering hull she helped build, running her hand along the cold metal like she was greeting an old friend. Keen reviewed updated mission plans, feeling the weight of responsibility deepen with every page he turned. Night settled over the shipyard while workers refused to slow, their tools glowing like stars, struggling to keep the darkness away. Ava stepped back to admire the hull, now nearly complete, its long shape stretching into the shadows as if already eager to touch the ocean. Jack finished another exhausting training day, sensing that he would soon be flying from one of these giants. Keen stood on a platform watching floodlights sweep across the steel, imagining the ship alive and breathing. Across the sea, Takamura stared at a fresh report claiming the Americans were close to launching not one but several carriers within months. For the first time, he felt a cold realization slip into his thoughts. This storm was only beginning. The first Essex-class carrier slid into open water with a slow, powerful grace that silenced the entire shipyard. Ava watched from the platform as the giant moved past her, its hull reflecting sunlight like a promise forged from sweat and sleepless nights. Jack received the news while prepping for sortie drills, a quiet thrill rising in his chest at the thought of what a ship like that could mean for pilots like him. Across the sea, Keen stepped aboard the new vessel for the first time, his footsteps echoing across endless steel corridors that felt fresh and expectant. Takamura heard rumors through scattered intelligence lines, but he refused to believe a ship of that size had launched so soon. The war was shifting, and everyone felt the pull as the world leaned towards something larger. Keen walked the length of the flight deck, feeling the weight of its vastness under his boots, as crews tested equipment with clockwork precision. Jack landed from a training flight, the new engines humming in a way that made him feel both safer and more aware of the responsibility strapped to him. Ava welded reinforcement plates on another hull, knowing that before long, this ship too would join the growing fleet. Meanwhile, Takamura listened to uneasy voices around the strategy table as more reports confirmed American shipyards were accelerating faster than expected. The air everywhere felt thicker, charged with anticipation that couldn't be ignored. Ava watched a second Essex-class carrier touch water, only weeks after the first, the crowd cheering as if witnessing the birth of something unstoppable. Jack prepared with his squadron for large-scale formation drills, the number of planes around him growing almost daily. He attended top-level briefings describing the expanding air groups and the expectations placed on these new giants. Meanwhile, Takamura stared at a fresh intelligence note reporting unprecedented launch rates, something he once believed impossible for any nation. The momentum was undeniable. sweeping everyone along whether they were ready or not. Takamura felt a chill as he listened to another officer confirm that American carriers were being completed so quickly that Japan could not even update charts fast enough. The numbers felt unreal, but the worry on the officers' faces was not. Jack flew in his largest formation yet, the sky crowded with planes that moved like a single massive wave. Ava sealed weld seams along a towering bow that felt more like the wall of a building than part of a ship. Keen stood on his bridge, absorbing every detail of his crew's growing coordination. The scale of what was coming began to take shape, and it was bigger than any one person could grasp. Night fell over the Pacific, but the Essex-class carriers glowed brightly under their deck lights, looking like floating cities ready to reshape the war. Jack stood on the deck beside his aircraft, feeling the vast steel beneath him like a living thing. Keen watched his crew move with practiced rhythm, understanding they were becoming part of something far greater than they imagined months ago. Ava rested against a rail after her shift, staring at distant ships illuminated across the harbor. Takamura read another report confirming more carriers were nearing completion, each line pressing harder on his thoughts. The engines of war were awake now, and no one could slow them. The sea looked calm that morning, but the stillness felt like the breath before a shout. Jack stood by his aircraft as crews rushed across the deck, their movements sharper, faster, guided by an urgency none bothered to explain. Keen studied the sky with a quiet intensity, sensing that this was the day the new carriers would prove themselves. Meanwhile, Ava listened to distant broadcasts from the shipyard announcing that more Essex-class hulls had touched water, each one adding strength to the fleet already at sea. Across the ocean, Takamura received the first confirmed reports of multiple American carriers appearing where intelligence had claimed only one existed. He felt something cold slide through him as he realized the scale was no rumor. The first shock of truth had arrived. Engines thundered as Jack's squadron roared into the sky, the carrier deck shrinking beneath them while the ocean spread out like an endless battlefield waiting to be written on. Keen watched the planes lift off in perfect intervals, each one carrying hope and danger in equal measure. Ava took a moment's breath in the shipyard, letting the echo of distant engines mix with the clanging of metal around her. Takamura listened to rapid radio transmissions from his fleet commanders, their voices tense as they reported more American aircraft than they had ever faced at once. Something massive was unfolding, and no one could stop it now. High above the ocean, Jack joined a wave of aircraft so large it cast shifting patterns of shadow on the water below. The formation moved as one, guided by discipline and a shared understanding that today would test everything the new carriers had been built for. Keen monitored the operation from the bridge, his crew moving with calm precision, even as tension thickened the air around them. Far away, Ava heard the first reports of the strike hitting its targets, her heart tightening with the knowledge that the steel she shaped was now part of the storm. Takamura received frantic updates of ships under attack, the shock in each commander's voice confirming what he already feared. The American carriers had arrived in numbers Japan was not prepared to face. Explosions echoed across the sea as Jack's squadron dove into their attack runs, the sky flashing with streaks of fire and bursts of smoke. He felt the tight pull of the dive, every sense sharpened to the edge as he released his payload. On the carrier, Keen gripped the command rail, listening to radio reports of direct hits and rising enemy confusion. Ava paused mid-weld, staring at a broadcast map that showed shifting lines of battle she had helped empower without ever stepping onto the waves. Takamura stood rigid in his war room, refusing to sit as each message confirmed his fleet was facing an enemy stronger than any prediction. The first shock had turned into harsh reality. When the smoke finally began to drift apart, Jack felt the weight of what had happened settle over him like a heavy coat. The attack was a success, yet the cost echoed through the airwaves as names of lost pilots came in. Keen kept his voice steady as he coordinated recovery efforts, but his shoulders carried the truth of every loss. Ava listened in silence to the updates, her chest tightening with the knowledge that every ship launched meant more families waiting for news they feared. Takamura stared at the sea outside his window, realizing that the tide of the war had shifted faster than any strategy could keep up with. The Essex-class carriers had proven themselves, and the world would not be the same. By mid-year, the fleet had grown so quickly that Jack felt as if the ocean itself had changed shape. Carriers stretched across the horizon like metal giants, each one humming with life, engines, and purpose. Keen walked the deck of his ship, feeling a strange mix of pride and heaviness as he watched new pilots arrive with bright faces that reminded him too much of the ones he had already lost. In the shipyard, Ava watched another Essex-class hull slide into the water, her heart thudding with the knowledge that this was the 24th of its kind. Far across the sea, Takamura read the same number in a report and felt the room tilt slightly under the weight of it. The tidal wave had arrived, and no one could pretend it wasn't sweeping the world forward, faster than any man could stop. Jack launched into another massive operation, the sky so crowded with Allied aircraft that it looked like a living storm. He felt the vibration of power beneath him, a sheer force made possible by the carriers rising one after another from Ava's shipyard. Kane listened to squadron updates flow in nonstop, each report layered with tension and determination. Ava paused before picking up her torch again, imagining Jack and thousands like him depending on what she built. Meanwhile, Takamura stood at a conference table surrounded by grim faces as they realized their remaining carriers were too few to meet this rising flood. Every corner of the war felt the force of the expanding fleet. The tide turned faster than anyone predicted. Jack's squadron struck multiple targets across a broad sweep of ocean, each mission blending into the next until time lost its edges. Keen watched carrier after carrier coordinate their operations with growing efficiency, their combined strength forming a force the enemy could no longer match. Ava heard radio messages celebrating victories, but each cheer carried an echo of pain, the kind only those touched by war could understand. Takamura received word that several Japanese carriers were gone, and he set the papers down slowly, unable to lift his eyes. The scale had tipped so far that return seemed impossible. Jack refueled on the deck, while alarms echoed across the fleet, reminding him that even overwhelming strength didn't erase the danger. Keen moved through the command tower with a calm that steadied the entire crew, yet beneath his steps lay the knowledge that every new victory brought new responsibilities. Ava worked late into the evening, sparks dancing in the air as she helped finish the next ship scheduled for launch. In a dim room across the sea, Takamura sat alone, thinking about the early days when he had dismissed American carriers as toys. Now he understood how quickly small things could grow into giants. The tidal wave wasn't slowing. As the sun set across the Pacific, Jack realized he was witnessing something historic. A fleet so large and so fast-growing that it erased the fears of the early war. Keen stood beside him for a rare moment of quiet, watching the glow of multiple carriers stretching across the water like floating suns. Ava closed her eyes after her shift ended, knowing she was helping build the very ships now lighting the ocean. And Takamura looked over the waves outside his command post, feeling the silence press harder than any explosion. The tidal wave of steel and determination had reshaped the war, and everyone, victors and defeated alike, felt its weight settle into their bones. The quiet after the latest battle felt heavier than the fight itself. Jack walked the deck slowly, hearing only the distant clang of tools and the soft hum of engines that refused to sleep. Keen joined him without a word, both men carrying the invisible weight of names they couldn't forget. Far away, Ava listened to a broadcast describing the latest victory, but instead of pride, she felt a dull ache knowing how much each success cost. Takamura sat in his dim office staring at the scattered reports, realizing that every loss on his side carried a story, a family, a world undone. Victory and defeat were beginning to look too similar, their edges blurred by exhaustion and sorrow. Jack leaned against the railing, staring out at the empty sea where wreckage had floated only hours before. The silence felt almost cruel after the chaos, leaving too much room for the mind to wander. Keen reviewed casualty lists with slow, steady breaths, each name pulling at him in ways he never allowed the crew to see. Ava wiped her hands on her work apron, thinking of the pilots who wouldn't return to land on the decks she helped build. Takamura reread his own reports, each one a reminder of how the early days of confidence had blinded him to the storm, now swallowing his fleet. The weight of what the war had become pressed down on every corner of their lives. The fleet moved forward, but Jack felt each mile stretch across him like a long shadow. The victories no longer carried the thrill they once did. Instead, they came with a heavy quiet that settled deep in the chest. Keen stood on the bridge, watching the formation glide across the waves, knowing the world saw strength, but the crew felt strain. In the shipyard, Ava walked past a memorial pinned with names, recognizing more and more faces from letters she had helped deliver. Takamura turned away from a naval briefing, unable to hide how deeply the losses were cutting into him. Strength was no longer just a number. It was a burden they all carried differently. Jack sat beside his aircraft, running his hand along the fuselage as if grounding himself against the storm inside his thoughts. Keen approached quietly, offering a rare moment of understanding in the form of simple silence. Ava returned home late from the shipyard, staring at her reflection in a dark window and wondering how many ships she would still need to finish before this all ended. Takamura read yet another report of lost ships, his heart tightening as he imagined the families waiting for news that would break them. Victory was starting to feel like a word without a shape, one that no longer meant what it once did. As night settled across the Pacific, Jack looked up at the stars and wondered how many men stared at the same sky from opposite sides of the war. Keen stood on the bridge with folded hands, knowing that even with overwhelming power behind them, the cost of each day was carving invisible marks into everyone aboard. Ava walked past the silent cranes of the shipyard, feeling the echo of every hammer strike she'd ever made, and Takamura sat alone, the darkness around him matching the heaviness he carried inside. The weight of victory pressed down like a rising tide, leaving no one untouched. The sea carried a softer sound now, as if the water itself had grown tired of war. Jack walked the deck slowly, feeling the quiet air press around him like a blanket stitched together from memories he wasn't sure how to hold. Keen watched him from a distance, sensing the same mix of relief and heaviness that had settled across the entire fleet. In the shipyard, Ava stepped through empty walkways that once boomed with sparks and metal, their silence almost startling after years of noise. Meanwhile, Takamura stared at an untouched cup of tea, knowing the war's end did not bring answers, only questions about everything lost along the way. Peace felt fragile, like a thin shell covering wounds too deep for time alone to heal. Jack rested his hands on the railing and watched the shore draw nearer, the coastline looking almost unreal after so long at sea. Keen stood beside him, offering a steady presence that didn't need words. Ava lifted her helmet from a hook in the shipyard and traced her fingers along the rim, remembering every spark she had ever struck in the name of something bigger. Across the ocean, Takamura folded away old reports, each page feeling heavier than the last as he tried to understand where belief ended and truth began. The world was moving forward, but each of them felt a part of themselves still anchored in the long, dark stretch behind them. Jack stepped onto land for the first time in months, the solid ground under his boots feeling strange and almost unfamiliar. Keen shook the hands of officers and crew, his face steady, though his eyes revealed a lifetime's worth of weight. Ava visited the near-empty production line, running her palm along the cold steel of one last unfinished hull, as if saying goodbye to a long chapter of her life. Meanwhile, Takamura walked through a quiet garden, each step stirring memories he wasn't ready to face. Between endings and beginnings, they all carried the same question. What does a person do when the storm finally stops, but the echo stays behind? The world slowly began to rebuild, but Jack found himself standing longer than usual on the quiet pier, listening to the soft lap of waves that once carried him into fire. Keen joined him for a moment, speaking gently about new roles, new ships, and new futures. though neither man felt ready to step fully into them. Ava sat at her workbench polishing old tools, unsure if she would ever use them again, yet unwilling to put them away. Takamura returned to his home, where the silence felt heavier than any battlefield, and he wondered how a man could rebuild honor when the past clung so tightly to him. The calm felt like a pause between heartbeats, waiting for someone to breathe first. Jack climbed to the carrier's edge one last time, watching the sun sink into the ocean where so many battles had once burned. Keen stood a few steps behind him, knowing the young pilot was searching for an answer no manual or order could give. Ava walked through the silent shipyard gates, feeling the weight of every ship she had helped bring into the world. And Takamura paused at the shoreline of his own country, letting the wind carry thoughts he had never spoken out loud. Between them all stretched the same quiet question, one that lingered in the air like a final breath. When power grows so great, it can change the world. How does a person make sure it doesn't change who they are?